with an invocation of a song written by Rabindranath Tagore, a well-known person. So let me just share the screen. Thank you so much for your kind attention. While listening to Rabindranath Tagore's song in Suman's voice, it seems as if Rabindranath himself is singing. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, Head of the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University, I welcome you on behalf of our university and also welcome you on behalf of SOHSS Co-Learning Circle of Self and Mutual Studies, Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. I have good pleasure welcoming Honorable Speaker Professor Marilyn, Strathern, eminent anthropologist, eminent professor, sociologist, social anthropologist, and life fellow, Gautam College, University of Cambridge. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available to us distinguished intellectuals and discussants like Professor John Clammer from Jindal Global University, Sonepat, Professor Kumar Giri, Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, moderator of today's session. And I can see so many respected friends, professors, Professor Sachi from Jamia Millia Islamia, Professor Vinita Singh, and all respected friends, participants, viewers, listeners. Before the talk, let me give a brief introduction to Honorable Speaker. Professor Marilyn is a fellow of British Academy and Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at University of Cambridge and was Mistress of Gautam College, Cambridge. Her work on gender relations and exchange has been foundational to rethinking the relationship between ontology, epistemology, and the others in anthropology as well as other social sciences. Her research interests have been divided between Melanesian and British ethnography. Papua New Guinea has been a principal area of fieldwork from 1964 to most recent in 2006, although she is also intrigued by development in knowledge practice in the United Kingdom and Europe. Initial work on gender relations led in two directions: feminist scholarship and the new reproductive technologies and legal systems and intellectual and cultural property. Over the last 25 years, she has published on reproductive technologies, intellectual and cultural property rights, and interdisciplinarity. She came to Cambridge as an undergraduate at Gautam, studying archaeology and anthropology, and stayed on there as a research student and then PhD candidate. Professor Strathern was made a fellow of British Academy in 1987 and then commander of the British Empire in 2001. She was awarded the Reviews Memorial Medal, Royal Anthropologist as 1976, Winner Green Foundation for Anthropological Research 2003, the Huxley Medal 2004, and she has been awarded several honorary degrees from universities in United Kingdom and abroad. She has authored many important books. She has authored more than 15 books. Some of books are also in our students' reading list. Some of the very important work in terms of book, I can recall Gender of Gift, Relation, the Anthropological Account from Duke University Press, the Gender of Gift, Problems with Women and Problems with Society in Malaysia from University of California Press, After Nature, English Kinship in late 20th century from Cambridge University Press, Partial Connections, properties such as anthropological essay on persons and king from Athlon Press, and so forth. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and we are very grateful to you. Before the talk, let me give a brief introduction to our SOHSS Chakra also. SOHSS Chakra, Circle for Creative Co-Learning and Mutual Studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chitranjan Das, a creative seeker and creative thinker from Orissa, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their lives, vision, sadhana, and a struggle for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. We are now nurturing this intellectual creative dialogue in collaboration with the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University. It is an initiative of Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. Today is a very special day. Today we are going to have the second talk on climate change, and as you know, the United Nations Climate Change Conference on Paris, which commenced on last Sunday in Glasgow, and we saw climate activists from various organizations across the world mobilize on a street demanding urgent measure to cut greenhouse gas emission from the heads of state attending the meeting. The COP26 negotiations are being called humanity's last best chance to save the earth. If that's true, is this the best way we can do? With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you so much, dear Randhir, and thank you so much, Professor Marilyn Strathern, for being with us, Professor John Clammer, Professor Sabyasachi, and all friends co-present. So it is indeed a joy to be with Professor Strathern this afternoon, and I recall the gift and blessings of my being able to communicate with Professor Strathern. Professor Strathern has deeply written about relationships, and as the paper, her paper this afternoon with us on hazards, on regeneration and its hazards. Now, Professor Marilyn Strathern is an anthropologist, but also she's a deep thinker, bringing philosophy, anthropology together. And that crafting of thinking and the gardening that Professor Strathern discusses with us in her paper, she is also a gardener of thought. And Professor Strathern really plants a thought, and she really gives her care and to make it grow. I am reminded here of a line from the great philosopher, Professor J.N. Mohanty, who builds on Edmund Husserl and the phenomenological tradition. And he says that thinking, though seems it is a joyless activity, but thinking like is the work of a jeweler. And as the jeweler is with something to make a jewel out of a gold or a silver, similarly, a philosopher is with that mode of thinking. And with Professor Strathern, it is not only a jeweler, but also a gardener. And her deep contribution emerges from that border crossing gardening, philosophy and anthropology, and as her other paper called The Gathered Field, in which She is discussing the work of Giri and and this whole idea of the rhizome, and she's telling us that it is not only that anthropologists they work with philosophical ideas like the rhizome, but taking that idea of the rhizome, how we can really look at rhizomes and the roots and have an alternative history and alternative cosmology. I remember my first communication with Professor Strathern, which was really gifted by Professor Andre Bete. And as I say these lines, I remember these opening lines of Confucius, who tells us in his book, Analects, that what a joy indeed when friends from different parts of the world meet together and study together. And today, this evening, this afternoon is an occasion like this when friends from different parts of the world are meeting together and studying together. When I met Professor Bete, who is my respected teacher, and I'm sure Professor Strathern knows him, as Professor Clammer, also as our dear friend Professor Sabyasachi, who is also going to offer some thoughts on Professor Strathern's paper. Professor Sabyasachi is a student of Professor J.P.S. Ubroy, who also has been an important scholar of the oceanic world. So Professor Bete told me that the kind of things that you are pursuing, it would be of interest to Professor Marilyn Strathern. Then in 1993, I wrote to Professor Strathern, and she very kindly sent me her book, Partial Connections. From 93, it has been a humble journey of learning with and being inspired by the work of Professor Strathern. Now, in her paper today, Professor Strathern raises many important issues. For example, she challenges us to realize the limits of valorization of life. And she writes, but if I just wonder if the valorization of life, the promise of it, its equation with a future, does not sometimes get in the way of actions we would like to take but cannot. It is in that spirit, I just wish to take a few minutes, 3-4 minutes, to engage with a few important things that Professor Strathern is gifting this afternoon, and I would quickly share a screen. Now, this idea of limits of valorization of life, it can relate to also similar critique of valorization of life. For example, as offered by Bina Das, another thoughtful thinker of our times who brings philosophy and anthropology together. In another context, Bina Das, building on Stanley Cavell, tells us, when anthropologists have evoked the idea of form of life, it has been to talk of thick description, local knowledge, or what it is to learn a root. For Cavell, such conventional views of the idea of form of life, it really eclipses some of the ideas of Wittgenstein's investigations. What Cavell finds wanting in this convention is that it not only obscures the mutual absorption of natural and social, but it also valorizes form at the expense of life. And I think Marilyn's pointer to limitation of valorization of life also finds resonant thoughts and critiques in such works like Cavell and Bina Das. And Bina Das continues that the whole thing is the blurring between what is human and what is not human sets into what is life and what is not life. Then coming to the issue of limits of life and regeneration, and here Marilyn writes, regeneration, the redistribution of life, thus indeed had its cost, its hazard. The Pacific gardener's emphasis on vegetative decay makes something more of death than its seeming instrumentalism in enabling new life to flow. Death is both an alternative mode of existence and one that itself comes to an end with further transformation, whether one is thinking of the fertility of the soil or former generation reappearing as present ones. So therefore, death as an alternative mode of existence, therefore it invites us to talk not only of form of life, but also form of death. And to join in this journey, we are invited for dialogue of cosmologies, because as Marilyn's deep critique of the Euro-American mode of thinking, and one of the part of the Euro-American mode of thinking is valorization of life. So to really understand death, and death with its hazard, but death also as a blessing, we need to engage ourselves with different cosmologies, philosophies, and civilizations. For example, not only talking about a new civilization of life consequent upon climate collapse and the possibilities of regeneration, but also a new civilization of death. And it is in this context we can engage with, for example, Indian traditions. In Indian traditions, there are deep dialogues with death. For example, in Savitri, which is part of Mahabharata, the dialogue between Savitri and death. And Sri Aurobindo has written an epic about it. In Mahabharata, there is also a dialogue between Yudhishthira, who is called Dharmaraj, and death. And that dialogue is happening in the lake called the Enchanted Lake. Yudhishthira is coming. Before him, his 4 brothers have gone to drink water from the lake. And there the Yakhya is saying, oh, my friend, you are coming to take water, but before drinking water, you please talk to me and answer my question. But these brothers are so arrogant, they do not listen to this voice. So as long as they take a little bit of water into their mouth, they drop dead. And its implication is that in a way, today the Mother Earth, the climate, wants us to listen to her voices. And when we are not able to, we do not have the elementary courtesy to listen to the voice, then we are dropping dead. Yudhishthira, on the other hand, he listens to the voice, and then he engages with this dialogue. And one of the questions that the Yakhya is asking, can you tell me who is a living corpse? And Yudhishthira is saying that a living corpse is one who really does not welcome the guest and who does not take care of one's parents, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the generic responsibility that Marilyn is talking about, and that generic responsibility, and with her work on generations, and generations of not only humans, but generations of plants, the life cycle of plants. So that generic responsibility is nurtured by paying attention to generations, but also to generosity. And therefore, generic responsibilities consist of this generosity, generativity coming together. I'm also thinking about the work of philosopher Charles Taylor, who in a similar way invites us to understand the limits of life. And though Taylor begins with his own Euro-American philosophical tradition and also his own religious tradition of Christianity, in his later life, he has been open to Buddhism, which has inspired him to think about the limits of life by cultivating the forest dimension in our life. And we can similarly, from a Christian tradition, we can think of developing the desert dimension of our life. And when we develop the forest dimension of our life, we have the possibility to overcome violence of civilization, though forest has its own hazards, as Marilyn would say. And here philosopher Ramachandra Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, who studied philosophy at Oxford, in his book Sita's Kitchen, Ramachandra Gandhi also tells us that when we come to the garden, then there is a possibility of a dialogue, and the dialogue happens in the forest in Ramachandra Gandhi. And linking this to Marilyn's work, therefore, the whole idea of the gardening and growing crops and growing roots, the forest dimension, gardening, gathering, and And this gathering also reminds us of Sangraha, that we are gathering. And in Indic conception, there's a very important idea of Loka Sangraha, gathering people, which is also related to gathering our self and soul. And today, in the context of climate collapse and in the context of the invitation for multi-species thinking and multi-species cohabitation, it is a gathering of all species together. Finally, I want to offer a poem with this notion that this whole notion of generic responsibility involves a rethinking of temporality, as Marilyn's deep works also suggest. Marilyn also has a paper called Class of Ontologies. But indeed, though she invites us to realize the class of ontologies that is happening, but her invitation is with the class, that how do we move towards the dialogues of ontologies, as dialogues of epistemologies, as dialogues of cosmologies and anthropologies. It is in that sense, it's an act of gathering with dialogues. And time, therefore, is not only the giving time, but an emergence. And that emergence also, it is that generic responsibility which is happening at the moment calls for a new ethics, which can be called as emergent ethics and emergent aesthetics. Finally, about time, I just wish to present this poem, which is not very visible in my screen. It goes like this. I am time, deep time, shallow time, geological time, historical time, biographical time. You talk about me, you find deep time in a rock, shallow time in plastic. You want to go deeper. How can you touch me? How do you realize me? Make bridge between time in life and history and the deep time. So with this, it's a joy for me to invite Professor Strathern, and just I wish to submit that after Professor Strathern's presentation, we would listen to Professor John Clammer's thoughts, and then Professor Sabyasachi's. And after these two discussions, we would request Marilyn to please reflect upon this. And after that, we would have our wide involving thoughts from all participants. So Marilyn, please.
Well, I'm quite overwhelmed by the generosity and the kindness, not just of your initial invitation, but for the context that both of you have created for what follows. You do realize, don't you, that it's a particular honor and pleasure to be addressing this circle of self and mutual studies, which I understand is part of a much wider scholarly, philosophical and creative endeavor to nurture an Asian center of learning. And I appreciate the global reach of your ventures, your interest in social theory, your embrace of scholars from diverse traditions. And that is, of course, prefigured in Dr. Giri's own life and works, which are something of an inspiration in themselves. In fact, I'm conscious that Ananta, you have just completed a volume under the very title, Global Responsibility. And my remarks today will be no more than a footnote. In turn, though, I am eagerly and humbly, if I may say, looking forward to what I can learn, and I mean from all of you. You'll forgive me if I read the paper, but I'm happy for it to be circulated if anybody is interested. It's divided into two parts with a preface and a brief postscript at the end, and I'm going to read out the section headings. I really appreciate the invitation to share some thoughts with you. They're unfinished, both because they're only the beginnings of some inquiries which might sound hopeful, but also because of what is not hopeful at all, which is that these days I'm only very inadequately aware of current thinking. So the chances are high that these inquiries will have been presented in other more fertile ways. Hope itself, of course, is one of those conditions of perception that carries our thinking forward, for it speaks to life in the future and the idea of life we use to signal survival, energy, productivity, a flourishing, the capacity for growth, regeneration, and the like. But I just wonder if the valorization of life, and and this is now an echo, but I just wonder if the valorization of life, the promise of it, its equation with a future, doesn't indeed sometimes get in the way of actions we would like to take, but cannot. We might think here of climate change and how the notion of responsibility gets parceled out among human and non-human actors. Responsibility has a double face. On the one hand, we need to be very clear about which human activities continue to contribute most to climate change, while on the other hand, not ignoring the generic or diffuse sense in which everyone is implicated, as everyone must be. In the first case, the channels along which responsibility runs are invariably prefigured, already cut into shape, and climate activists, among others, have to focus on reshaping them. The second raises more general queries about how people live their lives and the very contours of the world within which taking responsibility makes any sense. There are also questions precisely as to what is understood to be human when commentators point to the enduring impact of the Anthropocene, that is, human intervention evident as a geological stratum. We are, in effect, talking cosmologies. Thus, in worlds where final causes rest with persons, what so often falls on people are both the consequences of their own actions in whatever way they occur, and how their very being appears in the eyes of other persons. And other persons may include the range of godly, spirit, and earthly beings that one might call metapersons. Indeed, a person may cause offense just by being. All kinds of misfortune may thus be attributed to persons or categories of persons, whether implying on their part intention, malevolence, unwitting transgression, or implying vigilance on the part of their accusers in tracking down sources of evil and danger. At the same time, and this is the focus of responsibility that I pursue, I want to suggest that what to an outsider can seem most unjust may also accompany conditions of life that generate something comparable to a generic sense of responsibility. If I focus on such worlds, is to tell a tale that may be salutary for the one inhabited by the heirs of the European Enlightenment and its industrial financial legacy. It's one that does not subscribe to premises about final causes resting with persons, while at the same time practicing various forms of victimization astutely enough. The tale may also provide a comment on the cosmological entailments of such a European world that, with all its resources apparently at its disposal, describes itself as slow to act when urgent action is required, lamenting its own inability to respond to the ever-increasing evidence, including desperation on the part of some to learn from the COVID-19 pandemic before it's too late. Climate change deniers to one side, how come the consequences of certain actions are generally so hard to accept and recognize? Flowing into the geopolitics of standoff and competitive advantage taking is a still vigorous stream of debilitating assumptions about the nature of being, which I cut down to size by labeling them Euro-American. It's some of these assumptions about the nature of being that I'd like to bring to your attention. I start with gardens in quotation marks and gardens without quotation marks. I was completely enchanted when I came across Ananta's phrase, gardens of God. You'll be familiar with the thinking behind it, for he talks of the effort to rethink and reconstitute everything that is summed up in the language of the kingdom of God, and instead cultivate and generate a language of relationship to the garden of God. The image is powerful for the way it turns our thoughts, and in particular from a discourse of violence and power to one of non-violence and nurture. Importantly, though, nurture is not without effort. Indeed, he draws on two theological sources to toughen the image of God's working through appreciation of the backbreaking, sweaty, and unremitting labor that goes into gardening. I want to talk about gardens too, not for the image it gives us of a divine gardener, but for an insight into the nature of being that will, I hope, lead us to questions of responsibility. But there is a bridge between what I'm saying and what I've just quoted from Ananta. The bridge is the famous Gardens of Adonis, or Lord's Gardens, as described by the early 20th century classicist and anthropologist Fraser. Although Fraser uses a title that circulated among the ancient societies of Sumeria, Persia, and Greece, his examples range across the old and new worlds, and on one page you'll find an example from Brandenburg in Germany and another from Santiago in Chile. And as far as India is concerned, he draws on both Hindu and tribal folklore. Needless to say, all this finds Fraser describing many different forms of garden. That said, his prototype is a basket or pot filled with earth into which cereals or leafy vegetables are planted without roots, so that water and sun enables them to grow for a few days, it seems, before they wither away. It's a garden of life and death. The impetus to my comments today could also be called gardens of life and death. They belong to the ancient horticulturalists of the tropical Pacific, both the inhabitants of numerous islands and the large landmass known as Papua New Guinea, with which I'm most familiar. Now, I last visited Hagen in the Papua New Guinea highlands in 2015. Two things made an immediate impression. First, how dry it was, and we're talking of montane tropical environment that is normally very damp. Although Hagen was not at that point as badly affected as elsewhere, the whole country was in the middle of a particularly intense El Nino phase, and widespread drought was reported from many parts. Now, offshore islands of Papua New Guinea are used to periods of drought, but not the highlands on this scale, where people saw mountain streams dry up and crops die back. It was fortunate if there was money for imported rice. The shriveling of stems and leaves was a poignant glimpse into what it means for living plants to die. Planting sweet potatoes for the next crop is done through cuttings, so only a still living plant yields material for the future. In the case of more ancient root crops, such as yam or taro, what is planted will be a piece from the harvested tuber or corm. The second thing that struck me in 2015 was a scaling up of local food production. Where Hagen people had for long marketed vegetables, including many introduced varieties, I had not seen the subsistence food, sweet potato, being cultivated on such a large scale, more fields than gardens to sell in the town. Fed on sweet potato too, domestic pigs, always dependent on human caretakers, had become more so. But I was not prepared to see pigs on concrete. Now, in the past, pigs roamed freely inland between fenced gardens. Now it was they who were fenced. I knew that population pressure meant people couldn't deal with pigs getting into gardens and often tethered them for long periods. But permanently stalled on concrete, the old rationale had been that the animals could root up nutritious bits and pieces from their roamings, and I hadn't thought twice about the roaming pig, only marveled at their regular coming home at night. Regardless of what I knew of stock rearing in the UK, this sight of the Hagen pig permanently cooped up dismayed me, and the particular pigs that unnerved me were being looked after by someone called Helen, who long ago had chosen to take up residence at her father's rather than at her husband's place. And the pigs belonged to a cousin of hers, a manager for the then Papua New Guinea Australian liquefied gas project, his future bride wealth in mind. I expressed my consternation. Helen didn't get it. I commented that the pigs would miss being able to dig up the soil. She looked at me as though I hadn't understood the first thing about anything. Then with great patience, she explained that when they had plenty of land, people put their pigs to roam and dig up worms and things, but now there was no space and they were kept in pens and fed on sweet potatoes. In other words, this is the way things are done. Now is a new time. Her look said, surely you realize we're in another epoch. So what is happening here? My reaction to pigs on concrete is a nice example of ideas not being rooted in the present. I was recalling things as they'd been years before. However, the vision of plants shriveling from drought made an impression for the reverse reason, an epiphany, something I had known since 1964, but now saw again in a quite new way. This was the nature of the crops that people cultivated and the accompanying practices of regeneration. There's no seed stage. In the case of root crops, you need tubers to create tubers. Suddenly, the whole of Papua New Guinea is subsistence-based. The more recently introduced sweet potato, the much older yam and taro, as well as banana, sugarcane, sago, took on new significance because it was 2015. El Nino reports on the one hand and increased marketing ventures on the other. I was jolted into an ethnographic present as though the circumstances of 50 years ago had been waiting for me to catch up. For an anthropologist, the ethnographic present is also a moving horizon, and world concern with climate change over the last half decade has speeded up what has generally been known for more than 30. Local concerns with regeneration are nothing new either, but present times do a particular poignancy to them. And I come into the first part of the paper, which is called In the Anthropocene. Recent anthropological and other work among the many islands of the Pacific has been an impetus to appreciating events elsewhere in the Pacific, as in Papua New Guinea. One message conveyed through collaborative research on climate change as it affects the Pacific Islands is, and I'm quoting, some of the anthropogenic climate change's central premises have been standard ontological premises for many Pacific societies for centuries. This can be read in two directions. First, it's a comment about the way climate change has become a modern catch-all for calamities of all kinds. But second, it's also a comment on uncertainty as a persistent existential condition. Apocalyptic narratives aren't new to the Pacific either. Uncontrollable weather and island inundation must be joined to forced migration and to developers' ideologies of market and state. Thus, Pacific Islanders have often been told that they're tiny, remote, vulnerable. These attributes are not an invention of the present climate change era, but long-standing colonial tropes mobilized by interests advocating modernization. Potentially then, climate change gives Euro-Americans a fresh perspective on colonization. In other words, the changing circumstances of the anthropologist's own world have made at least one earlier horizon, colonialism, easier to comprehend. Perhaps the mantra of climate change is doing some useful work here. Perhaps we can reperceive that trope, that colonial trope of vulnerability, that is, allow present circumstances to carry a new sense of what colonialism was and still involves. It's as though the West were catching up with its past self. And it's as though the West, Euro-American capitalist, once industrial and now financialized, saw itself up against an implacable fate. Well, the thinking bits of the West anyway, those who feel themselves up against a wall of miscomprehension, not just on the part of climate change deniers, but of innumerable, very respectable persons as well. Hence a vital question to which this focused on Pacific climate cultures leads, how Western ideologies and ontologies make climate change as the consequence of certain actions generally so hard to accept and recognized. There's an implied moral judgment here on my part, as has been made of Pacific Islanders who resort to a ready-made discourse to cover any manner of need or grievance. Thus, environmental workers in Samoa find that the idea of climate change has become a veritable resource on which people draw, while also, and I quote, a convenient way for people to sidestep personal, traditional, ordinary environmental responsibility. Distant causes absolve local people from responsibility, it said. We could put it otherwise, of course, namely that they've found a way of articulating, precisely in distant, impersonal terms, some of the forces that Euro-Americans routinely ascribe to abstract phenomena, such as technology, science, law. Thus making visible the record of people's activity in terms of a new geological layer, the Anthropocene so-called, conjures an appropriately generic sense of moral judgment, even as it defers the question of precise responsibility. If some Pacific Islanders have long been living in Anthropocenic-like conditions, given the uncertainties they've had to weather, I wonder if there is not a quite different sense in which they and many others also bear the mark of the Anthropocene. That is to do with their own activity, which in turn throws light on Euro-American modes of inaction. Whether or not dating the Anthropocene to the 400 years of the Capitalocene or to the distant Neolithic, writers point to the enduring impact of the human footprint. Perhaps we should consider something very familiar to scholars interested in the world's cultures and societies, the role people give to human intervention. For Pacific Islanders and Papua New Guineans alike, signs of people's actions were once everywhere, and this bears precisely on questions of responsibility. I turn to regenerating people. The activity of human beings is how those with an idea of an autonomous nature would phrase it. I prefer rather to talk of personal beings, including all manner of metapersons, translatable into English as ancestors, spirits, or gods, not to speak of wild. In any event, the way the world is and all its circumstances and events originate in beings whose activity is thus, so to speak, in everything. And if Papua New Guineans once saw signs of persons' actions everywhere, this was true not least when it concerned growth and regeneration. The ethnographic record of the last century is full of accounts of people's concern with generation and regeneration, increased magic, fertility cults, growth rituals, and the staging of public performances to engage diverse metapersons. In Hagen, Cult activity became imperative when crops failed, pigs fell sick, and children died, or they were to preempt such calamity. Magic, cult, ritual, these concepts are overdetermined in English if they appear to fence off a realm of sacred as opposed to mundane affairs. Rather, there were moments when extra effort was summoned through intensified degrees of action. For people were under the constant onslaught of beings out to harm them, make them ill, cause crops to die, whether through willful caprice or motivated as the consequences of particular acts. Indeed, the activity of all kinds of personal beings is invariably interwoven with moral concerns. Now, in taking action to renew life, to make it present again, the presence of death is also, of course, renewed. If death is a hazard, then the dangers or hazards of regeneration are substantial. But I suggest that it's only in taking regeneration and its hazards together that we arrive at something like an indigenous analogy to moral considerations of generic responsibility. Since action is always needed to keep life in circulation, regeneration is not automatic. Everything is uncertain. One cannot, in this part of the world, depend on things to grow by themselves or recur unaided. And this is true on an everyday scale, whether in the way children mature or plants flourish, or one generation of people replaces another. Growth has to be effected through particular kinds of attention, gifts given, imprecations uttered, bodies marked. These interventions come from the necessity to keep the world turning, in which, so to speak, nothing happens without personal effort, whether the person is living, dead, or other than human. The recurrent imperative to act is bound up with ideas of time, for every action has its own future, changing the present thereby. Indeed, in one sense, the present is a constant re-radicalization of a cut with the past. And it was such an epochal sense of time that I think Helen was implying, and I come back to this. There is more to such a radical separation than a penchant for dualistic thinking. We're talking about the effort, like the divine gardener's ceaseless labors, the effort that people put into recreating all forms of life. And the effort includes separating or differentiating between elements of what is taken for granted as the immanent entailments of persons or relations in one another. Take social forms of regeneration, where we might be surprised by the extent to which they entail divisions between personal beings. The living must be separated from the dead as a precondition of obtaining benefits through sacrifice. Under some regimes, a bride is dramatically severed from her kin in order to bring fertility to her husband's clan. Or the body of the male initiand may be literally cut to release harmful influences. People act upon themselves and upon other versions of themselves. In many cases, such action is accompanied by loss or pain, or by a heavy sense of debt or constraints on behavior. Vulnerability would certainly describe the exposure of male Hagen performers when they sought public renown, divided from spectators who acted as the emotional recipients of their display. These are hazards indeed, making demands on persons and at their extreme ending in death. That said, such separations are generally held to have socially generative outcomes, or rather such is true for certain aspects of futures at the expense of others. What plays out among persons seems played out in repeated acts of horticultural regeneration. This was the basis of livelihood in old Papua New Guinea. We should pay attention, not because these people are closer to nature than their Euro-American counterparts, since there is no nature, but because the world is full of persons. They're constantly aware of the consequences of personal action. And it's in this sense I've suggested they live in an Anthropocene. But if you think this is just being tricky with words, consider what that reperception or redescription does. It makes us look again at the way ordinary living people do or do not take responsibility for their actions. For a start, they don't shrink from the idea that life involves death and that everything has its cost. If you'll allow me, I'll work through a specific instance under regenerating plants. A couple of years ago, the journal Nature and Culture published a collection of essays on agriculture in the Anthropocene, drawing anthropological contributions from across the world. Indeed, it was interesting to read about the 2015 El Nino event as it affected farmers in Africa, where blame was put on the lack of preparedness of individual farms and other rationales for managing crops at risk. Responding to an anthropocenic question raised by Bruno Latour about how to think of responsibility and the role that global agriculture plays, the collection explored on-the-ground perceptions between crops, farmers, and weather, all mediated by varieties of expertise, agrometeorology, environmental planning, and so forth. The studies involved crops cultivated through seed, where if you think about it, the generative unit is the whole crop, including specialist provision for seed production, not the whole or entire plant. I speculate about how such factors might bear upon people's awareness of their interventions. A contribution on Poland in Europe was the only essay concerning a root crop, namely sugar beet. I was struck not just by its emphasis on farmers' empathy with their plants, but by something on which farmers didn't remark, although it emerged clearly from the ethnography. Sugar beet normally grows over 2 years, and in its first, the taproot stores nutrients for its second year flowering and seeding. But I quote, "Only the farmer knows that there is not going to be a second year, and that the beet is going to be sent for processing before the next springtime." The plant's own regenerative potential is thus interrupted before its first year is concluded. People divert its life course. Instead, that regenerative potential flows from plant to the plants other than plant keepers, the farmers. It's the farmers who are enabled to propagate themselves, and farming people are ever attentive to the relationship between crop continuity and personal livelihood, and I'm still keeping with the Polish example. In other words, the consumption of that part of the plant for which it's being cultivated becomes separated from the production of seed for the next planting. Beet growing for seed takes place elsewhere. Well, obviously, you might say, this is all part of the development of food cultivation that began in the Neolithic. Yet consider how the ethnographer referred to what the farmer knows axiomatically without remarking on it. It gives a special interest to the horticultural regimes of the Pacific and to their tropical corms and tubers. As we've seen, these root crops are propagated vegetatively. In Papua New Guinea, varieties have been selected over millennia to conserve sugar content, just as in beet, but in their case, apparently, at the deliberate expense of seeds, whose potential is played down or ignored. Although yam and taro plants produce seeds, new plants are always propagated from the cuttings, and the division into what is for eating and what is for planting takes another route. As a result, a harvested plant appears, to the observer anyway, as a manifestation of a discrete entity with its own future still ahead. In the case of root crops, it's the part of the actual corm or tuber is replanted. So the generative unit is the whole plant, which completes its life course in producing another out of itself. Now, a counterpart to the Polish farmer's empathy appears in parallels that many Papua New Guineans make between nurturing plants and nurturing persons. So I raise the question whether, on the horticulturalist's part, the process of harvesting and planting might not be accompanied by something like a local apprehension about the consequences of intervening in another being's life. Now, I don't have the means to answer the question directly. I can only wonder whether intervention is the more visible in that post-harvest, the living plant potentially resumes its own course to death and rebirth. But what does that course actually entail? As was noted, the staple foods include yam, taro, sugarcane, banana, on which many of the indigenous populations of the Pacific subsisted before the pre-colonial arrival of sweet potato and colonially rice, refined sugar, and wheat. Those ancient food sources were prone to cataclysmic events, not just water shortage on the islands, but frost in the interior. The 2015 drought being a glimpse into what it meant for living plants to perish. Under a regime of vegetative reproduction, where the next crop is cut from the present one, there is no recourse to a seed store. As I've said, only a still living plant yields plant material for the future. Taro serves as an exemplar. The harvested corm has its head sliced off for replanting, divided thereby from the rest. The taro is thus made present as a unique particular entity grown from a previous version of itself, in turn giving life to its successor. The leap to thinking of the succession of generations of people is explicit. In the past, Papua New Guineans aligned themselves in manifold ways with the crops they grew and with the soil in which these flourished. Persons and plants were explicit co-partners in propagation. Crops were not considered to grow by themselves any more than people did. Each cared for the other, and each suffered from the other's neglect. There was an implacable logic behind it all. While taken over time, generation was continuous. In terms of particular entities, this person, that yam tuber, older generations had to die for new generations to spring forth. For persons, what intervened between grandparent and grandchild was the redistribution of the sources of regeneration at initiation and marriage, which created new parental procreative origins for the offspring to follow, parents reproducing themselves before dying. What intervened between harvesting one corm or tuber and then harvesting its successor months later was cutting the former to create the parental, and the bit that was cut was often called the mother or father in local idioms, was cutting the tuber to create the parental plant fragments to be replanted. And these fragments, in nourishing new shoots, would themselves shrivel away. Especially with taro and yam, people articulate the fact that the underground parent perishes in order for its child to grow. For that dying to be imagined, the life of the plant is perpetuated beyond its harvest, now above ground, in the cutting away of that crucial regenerative fragment. So it's not enough just to say that plants and people nourish one another to cross-species benefit. It's people who act under the moral imperative of ensuring that the parental plants die. Like growing in this part of the world, dying does not take place without assistance. In short, the very succession of the generations required something of an epochal and thus an apocalyptic vision. regeneration demanded that people act out its hazards. Now, I've no idea what kind of acknowledgement of people's actions one will be justified in eliciting or interpreting from the interventions by which they benefit from the life cycles and potential regenerative futures of other beings, plants included, or even whether this is an explicit indigenous calculus. Ordinarily, regardless of who carries out an action, the act belongs to the person who claims to or is accused of causing it. And that someone thus bears responsibility for it, whoever actually carries out the act. Did people's actions in propagating plants contribute to the realities that they knew to be a generic condition of their existence, namely that a repetition of life, as regenerated from the plant fragment, entailed a repetition of death, as in the fragment's decay and demise? Let me take something like this as a central message from the Yatmal people, as a leading Papua New Guinean scholar has rendered it. In his account, life and death are elder brother and younger brother to each other. The one cannot be summoned without the other, and that other is a version of the one from whose perspective one sees. No person escapes the necessity of their own death for life to continue, and of their own life for death to continue. In a foreign idiom, everything has its cost, and the cost is borne bodily, directly. This was not a cosmology in which it was possible to trade in indirect third-party carbon credits. And I'll come back to that. I move to a somewhat shorter second part, and we'll talk first about a temporal shift. A quotation from some European archaeologists might momentarily hold our attention. There's been a paradigm shift, they say, in how we understand the scales and rates of natural climate change in the Holocene epoch, spanning the last 11,500 years. The old paradigm of slow, gradual change has been replaced by one in which change can be described as abrupt, occurring over short timescales of centuries or less, separated by comparative long periods of quasi-stasis. End quote. The archaeologists in question are pressing home the need to relate such changes to human social change. How goes their question? Did past communities perceive the natural changes? If we were to turn this into an anthropologist's question about the effects of deep time on the writer from whom I take that phrase is referring to geological time, the effects of deep time on our lives, we would surely be thinking about the way such shifts in perception might have an interest in present times. Perhaps we might also be jolted into appreciating people's ability to bring about abrupt transitions in their own lives. I'm quoting, "Steady states ruptured by catastrophic events that restructure the world and result in new steady states." This is a description of what an ethnographer of a yam-growing area in Papua New Guinea has called an episodic view of time. The yam gardener sees the past divided into sharply discontinuous epochs: the time of the ancestors, the time of fighting, the time of the colonials, the time of independence. When change happens, it is abrupt, cataclysmic, all at once. To me, such eras or epochs of episodic time seem to be scaled up versions of everyday ruptures. And here people's hands are visible. They make dramatic ruptures out of the very cycle of life, marriage, initiation, and transformation into an ancestor. The quotation on paradigmatic change was introduced as a comment on what it takes an outsider to appreciate episodic change. What is it about Euro-American temporalities that interpret abrupt transitions as exotic? Are their ideas about evolution and the flow of time so axiomatic that continuity appears to be the very opposite of change, so that juxtaposing the two produces a kind of frisson? In this Euro-American view, steady states or timelessness must imply lack of change rather than a horizon for the next change. In any event, lack of change has been a powerful default mode in colonial thinking on peoples such as those of the Pacific. Here appears part of the question posed at the outset: how Western ideologies and ontologies have made climate change as the consequence of certain actions so hard to recognize, accept, and act upon. Now, two aspects of Papua New Guinea cultivation could serve as a commentary on certain Euro-American narratives about what they, Euro-Americans, Westerners, call human activity, throwing into relief aspects of the narrative of the Anthropocene, and specifically what is called the Capitalocene, that usually escape attention. One concerns the cloning-like effects of vegetative reproduction, the other apparent selecting out of seeds over the course of their domestication. So I'm going to talk very briefly about clones and seeds. The Euro-American concept of a clone embodies the very idea of continuity. And there seems an indubitable continuity about those ancient crops, taro and yam, not least because of the obviousness of the way plants are regenerated from living plants. The way one kin generation grows out of another is also claimed for the perpetuation of clan groups. So it's very easy for Euro-American observers to draw on the metaphor of cloning with a nod to those who know about genetics. But the extent to which like emerges from like misses out half the story. To look only at the sequence of plants ignores the radical moment at which growth is altogether stopped, when the taro to be eaten is severed from the stalk to be planted. As we've heard, propagation depends on the division of the corm or tuber in order for a new one to spring in its place. That crucial interruption, the creation of the parent plant from the child, is where, in social life, persons must divide themselves in order to reproduce too. They divide by gender, by clan, by generation, by moiety. Grandchildren appear in the place of grandparents only because parents have been divided from children, male from female, and so forth. This aspect of regeneration is episodic. And if you look again at the so-called cloning, whether of root crops or of people, what is entailed in regeneration by the intervention of propagation practices gives each replacement a new horizon of relationships. In the case of plants, this is emphatically enacted in the way people constantly search for new varieties to be planted alongside one another, and they open up fresh soil to ever change the plant's growing conditions. If this is a world in which time does not flow of itself, it doesn't present a timeless plateau either. There is time indeed, too much temporality, one might say, in the perpetual creation of horizon-creating events. And yet, just like the Euro-American image of time's flow, the concept of cloning, regardless of its genetic respectability, is a profound misrecognition of the process of indigenous regeneration. These plants only appear clone-like if one misses out those episodic processes. Now, in the Euro-American imagination, of course, genetics can't be pushed to one side. Genetic knowledge is the culmination of millennia-long narratives of agricultural civilizations, and I'm here speaking Euro-American, based on grain, the issues revolving around the nutritional benefit of grain production, storage potential, and improving seed quality through sexual reproduction. The plant's own episodic temporality is exploited, and we saw this in the transformation of the sugar beet's 2-year cycle. A cycle is understood as a natural process into which people can intervene. In fact, it might appear that the Euro-American need to divide a whole harvest of cereal or beet, say, into what can be used as food and what has to be replanted, a division between divergent uses for the plant, offers an analogy to cutting in vegetative regeneration. But that, I think, is misleading. In fact, the division between nutrition and germination puts into another Euro-American register what is often speculated about grain cultivation and about notions of the future, exemplified in the flowering stage of any seed-producing plant. It is the stage that is a kind of third party to plant life, one that can be outsourced as carbon credits are outsourced through others' credits. For that botanical stage, the flowering is the site of the crucial act of fertilization that has allowed selection through genetic modification. Yet while awaiting fertilization, flowers themselves are neither germinating nor significantly nutritious. The future is deferred. You can anticipate the contrast here. There is no space in the corm or tuber life cycle for such a deferral of future life, for third-party activity, as it were, but rather a recursive vitality that, without mediation, repeats past generations. That said, such Euro-American narratives of clones and seeds already mobilizes an industrial imaginary. One particularly famous feminist framing of a critique about capital and the replenishment of resources posed a contrast between agriculture and industry. In that contrast, an expansion of people's activity as labor, in the same way cultivation enables a crop such as, while cultivation enables a crop such as trees to produce more trees. That is both to enlarge what is available for consumption and to reproduce. But in industrial production, through the work they do, people's activity increases the consumer value of timber, but the material of it is in a form that no longer reproduces itself. And as this critic says, a dead tree cannot produce, nor can it be assisted to produce more trees. Sorry, I'll come back to that later if my reading wasn't the most brilliant. Apologies. But I want to go on to say that despite that quite energizing contrast, it seems to me that the way in which agriculture itself is conceptualized is already drawing on industrial thinking. Thus, between them, clones and seeds together offer Euro-Americans a model of the nature of being in terms of human activity, colloquially valued as creativity. And it's one that has helped engender the Capitalocene. Industrially conceived, clones and seeds model a double capacity. The capacity of clones, whether from the age of plantations and factories or from the age of mechanical reproduction, is to multiply without changing, as though products were clones of one another. The capacity of seeds, through being susceptible to improvement and innovation, summons thoughts that inseminate, ideas that germinate, and a generalized human spark within every individual. Jointly, the seed idea, embodied in instructions for production, can be turned to reproducing innumerable copies. Within Euro-American cosmology, I want to suggest this is a magical combination and one that accords people's activity unlimited potential. Meanwhile, the work of regeneration becomes subject to other interventions, such as experimental or commercial seed growing, and in happening somewhere else is in this sense deferred. Perhaps imaginaries of this kind make the sequence of climate change hard to recognize. For in the combined magic of seeding and cloning, the costs of regeneration are not built in, and it seems awfully hard to do so after the event. And I come finally to a section called Counting the Costs, brackets, really. I propose there's something else, some might think more profound, at stake. It lies in a detail of the process by which those tropical cultivars in the Pacific regenerate. On the surface, just as propagation by seed involves dividing the whole crop, not the whole plant, so one might think of a taro or yam harvest composed of several beings with different destinies. Yet if we dig a bit deeper, each cultivated corm or tuber manifests an entire life cycle in itself. Cutting a corm or tuber puts before people's eyes the image of a being capable of partitioning. Insofar as the severed, planted part affords new life a nutritive base, it itself must rot. Importantly, its rotting started at harvest. When the tuber or corm was killed by its human caretakers, new life had, in a sense, already begun. Life had been redistributed, rechanneled into a newly living being. The plant to take its place is not in that sense in a deferred future. Rather, it will has already ushered in a new epoch, the horizon of a new present. Concomitantly, past and future are figured in ways quite unfamiliar to the logic of capital accumulation. As the potency of their gardens depends on material replenishment, so across the generations, people have been able to return to previous moments of activity as a generative horizon for the present. Both are the direct result of the forward consequences of people's previous actions, and one might say of all the dying that had had to take place. Regeneration, the redistribution of life, thus indeed has its costs, its hazard. The Pacific gardener's emphasis on vegetative decay, and that is explicit, makes something more of death than its seeming instrumentalism in enabling new life to flow. Death is both an alternative mode of existence and one that itself comes to an end in further transformations, whether one is thinking of the fertility of the soil or of former regenerations appearing as present ones. It's a view that makes the taking of life crucial for the replacement of one body, human, animal, or plant, by another, embraced in ways I cannot elaborate on here. For example, when bride wealth appears like a mortuary payment to sever a bride from her kin, it certainly seems to the observer to be reiterated over and again in the everyday routine of gardening. The profound aspect is the way this clashes with a strong Euro-American aversion to dwelling on death, and when it comes to persons, with an impoverished sense of an individual life snuffed out. What is impoverishing is the location of responsibility. Constantly confronted with the killing of beings, by contrast, the inhabitants of old Papua New Guinea appear to imagine that death is always someone's responsibility, a matter of privilege as well as liability, but invariably with hazardous implications for life. Who will take revenge? Will this grow? A whole entity, momentarily created at the time of death, is then dismembered. The doer of the deed is an agent of the persons who caused it and for whose benefit it is done. Benefits may be immediate, as in accomplishing retribution, or remote, as in hopes of future fertility. Thus, I've suggested that it's only in taking regeneration and its hazards together that we might arrive at something like a Pacific analogy to considerations of generic responsibility. Those Pacific gardens of life and death, they throw into relief certain Euro-American assumptions about the nature of being. Euro-Americans are full of the virtues of life and how to ensure life continues. Yet a conceptualization that serves so well in many contexts, as in promotions of sustainability and ever-renewable resources, falls short in one regard. It can easily leave out responsibility for the cost. Above all, I don't think their, Euro-American, my own, impoverished sense of death really equips us for acknowledging people's causative roles in the present ecological crisis. And I have a very short postscript if you can bear a few more minutes. Recall that moment in Hagen in 2015 in the Papua New Guinea highlands, and Helen's gentle chastisement of me. We were in a new time. Helen's elderly father personified it in his calibration with his own body. He commented to me on his once flourishing cash crop coffee. He had cut down the shade trees to sell the timber. He told me that people had said that the coffee wasn't doing so well because he was growing old and his coffee was dying alongside him. He was anticipating his death. Now, in fact, I was told, oh, now you're old, Marilyn, you're growing down now, you'll die soon, but your children, of course, are growing up. A new time does not just mean new houses or new bodies holding themselves in different ways, but a kind of double horizon, for it also involves a cut with the past. This is not to dismiss the past, but to create a horizon creating disjuncture, just as new horizons will appear in the future. People there frequently think about the future in terms of what the past will yield for them, including the land that nourishes them. Now, not far from those pig pens that so dismayed me was a garden that before he died, Helen's father planted to profit from and regenerate in that sense, because he was planning to turn it into a veritable field of sweet potatoes to sell. Now, underneath this particular patch of ground lay layers of drainage ditches and channels and remains of cultivation mounds, which have been excavated over the last 40 years by archaeologists from Australia and the National Museum in Port Moresby. The remains go back some 10,000 years before present. Major deforestation in the area dates from 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, by which time all the main cultivars I've been talking about were being exploited for food on this site. The first clear evidence of cultivation practices go back also to the horizon of about 7,000 years ago. The early practices of mounding and ditching show people attending to both water-tolerant plants, such as taro, and water-intolerant plants, such as yam, as well as devising methods of recycling nutrients through mulching. I come to my final paragraph. The story is far from seamless, though. There have been many breaks in the archaeological record. And when I talked to Helen's father and others of her menfolk, they took discontinuity in a further sense. They professed to have no idea who might have dug those early ditches. Their interest in the site did not depend on demonstrating unbroken continuity. Rather, as I would put it, it was generative then, and just as it was generative then, so it is generative now. That they themselves flourished there, growing the same crops, is like re-energizing or reanimating what had flourished before. Life flows through new conduits. But there never was, and is never, any certainty about this process. Much work, including to extrapolate the work of death, had to happen along the way. And thank you for your considerable patience. I'm very much looking forward to any comments that you might have. And might I, just before Professor Clammer begins, just to say how profoundly grateful I am that he's agreed to come and say a few words. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for your deep and many-sided, insightful, and so kind engagement. Among many things, what struck me, your also ability to listen to the cries of the pigs when you said the pigs must also miss their habit of digging the soil. And this is really an anthropology of a different kind. Thank you. And now, John, please.
Thank you very much, Ananta, and thank you very much, Dame Marilyn, for your rich and thoughtful paper. I'm not going to try and summarize it, but what I would like to do would be to try and draw out a few key ideas in your paper that struck me as especially interesting, especially worth perhaps talking about. I hope that will resonate both with you and with other people here tonight. Well, regeneration seems to be in the news. This time last week, at this very webinar, of course, we had a speaker who was a marine biologist who literally works on regeneration, regenerating mangroves and regenerating seagrass and other marine plants, this kind of stuff. But of course, you've taken a profoundly different approach to this, which I think in a sense is not only anthropological, but is philosophical as well. I think the question of climate change does, as I think you suggest, really raise this question of responsibility, but in a fascinating and complex way. The philosopher Timothy Morton, I don't know if you know his work at all, has argued basically, of course, not against the idea of ecology, but essentially each one of us, recycling our newspapers and not creating too much waste and, putting our cans out in the right trash bag, can, that kind of thing, very good. So, but it makes no difference whatsoever to the fate of the planet. Now, whether we scaled that up, of course, and found that if enough people were doing the same kind of thing, were genuinely recycling and attempting to lead modest lifestyles, there would be, of course, substantial impact. But I think it raises this question of the peculiar, possibly guilt or powerlessness that sometimes accompanies the feeling of what, as you put it, I think in your paper, why is it so hard to act? And obviously we can blame the usual suspects, of course, the politicians, and we can, of course, blame industry. We can blame the climate change skeptics who resist the idea that fossil fuel should be scaled down and this kind of stuff. But I think we're still left with this difficult question about how we take responsibility, sometimes as individuals. And in fact, I feel this sometimes a rather Kafka-esque situation. Some of you may know, of course, the work of the novelist Franz Kafka. And in one of his stories, he talks about the person who is arrested for a crime, but the nature of the crime is not revealed to him. And when we asked the prosecutor, he said, "But you've arrested me. What is my crime? Tell me what I'm accused of." They say, "Well, since you committed the crime, you must know." Well, I don't know, right? And the story goes on like this until, of course, we reach the point at which the victim, as it were, begins to believe he must have committed a crime. Otherwise, the rational processes of the law and so on would not have singled him out for prosecution if he had not been guilty of something. And I think a lot of us rather feel a bit like the character in Kafka's story. Somehow we're all implicated in all this. If we get in a plane, we worry about this now. If we get in a car, we worry about whether we should have one and all this kind of stuff without really being sure how all this really hangs together in terms of action, which might in fact affect the clearly negative dimensions of climate change that are happening around us, and we see this. So in that context, I think your paper, Dame Marilyn, raises fascinating questions. So let me again pick up just a number of those. I always love this phrase that you quote from Marshall Salins about meta-persons. I think that's such a nice phrase to encompass, gods, spirits, demons, sprites, whatever we have, gnomes, elves, or whatever other beings we might think are divas of some kind are affecting the nature of the world. And one aspect of this whole debate is, I think, about not so much the loss of the meta-persons, but their role in this debate. Now, on the one hand, I see a lot of literature coming out of religious circles from basically all religious traditions, which are now trying to address the ecological crisis. Christianity from Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhists, very much so. But yet that counter dialogue, as it were, or counter language, important as it is, does not seem to be absorbed into this debate very centrally. And I find that odd for at least two reasons. One is that in facing disaster, I think, who was it? Who was the poet who said, you know, there are no atheists in the foxholes? You know, if you're in the trenches, suddenly you might discover a religious belief that you previously thought you really had. You'd given up all that kind of nonsense. But, you know, being under fire maybe changes your mind to some extent. Now, here we are under fire. And yet, while I think within certain religious communities, there is an attempt to bring the meta-person back into debate, somehow that is not really penetrated deeper levels of this discussion, I think, and that intrigues me. Maybe you have, as an anthropologist, perhaps have a solution to this. Why is this, in fact, not the case? There may well be people out there, you know, looking for their garden gnomes or something and trying to, you know, encourage them to do something about the weather, this kind of stuff. But yet, at a time when on the one hand, we've heard about secularization, but on the other hand, we've seen the revival of so many forms of religion in the last 1 or 2 or 3 decades. It's like active participants in social and cultural life. Well, where have the meta-persons gone in this debate? Now, is it that they've been assimilated into what? No, I hadn't thought about Levi-Strauss for months and months and months. I don't think about him an awful lot, but oddly enough, I was thinking about him yesterday because I was reading something which touched on Levi-Strauss. I'm thinking about, well, have the meta-persons become the kind of structures of which he talked? Somehow beneath the kind of debate, the science, the intergovernmental panel on climate change, and all these kind of, you know, this data that is reaching us. There is a search for a kind of deeper structure. What is the meaning of all this in terms of a kind of larger, almost kind of cosmic process? Is there such a thing? Or do we have to simply accept that we're caught up in a bunch of contingencies which are running almost untamed now, for which we are in some sense responsible? If we look back at our own history, you know, we did it, we're guilty. But yet we don't have any resource to turn to outside ourselves in order to find some kind of solution beyond the obvious ones that I'm sure are being discussed at this moment in Glasgow. You know, not cutting down forests, phasing out coal-fired power stations, this kind of stuff. When we were talking about your friend Helen, I mean, she of the concrete pigs. I mean, not the concrete pigs, the pigs in concrete. She also reminded me of something. The late sociologist Ulrich Beck, his final and actually posthumous book is called Metamorphosis of the World, in which he argues something. It seems to me that Helen seems to be a kind of New Guinea Ulrich Beck. In that book, he basically argues that the old language of like social change, even social transformation, doesn't work anymore. We have, in fact, really entered a new epoch, that new ethnographic present of which you are speaking, for which we don't yet particularly have the tools to analyze it. And we're in that sort of strange space between the recognition of the crisis, but a lack of effective ways in which we can address it in ways that would really be seen to have, you know, a positive effect. When you talk about rereading the past, that same thought struck me very, very directly. It's on page 5 of your paper, if anybody has the copy of them. You talk about the West as if, you know, the idea as if the West were catching up with its past self. Now, it seems to me it's a very interesting project here for somebody to take up. Is a rereading of the past, not in the proportion of blame. You know, well, it was industrialists from the late 19th century onwards. It was, you know, probably the fault of the British, I'm afraid, because, you know, inventing the Industrial Revolution, you know, we've been cutting down trees, we've been digging up coal, we've been doing all this kind of stuff. That there is potentially an alternative reading of the past, which is one that points us perhaps to the very mechanisms which have brought us to our current impasse. And it would be very interesting to, I think, explore that possibility. Can we read backwards into history to find clues, in fact, not to a sense where we went wrong, but to the fundamental, I think, ontological question about the nature of being, which you raised in your paper, which I think is a key to this whole discussion. What is the nature of our being, and what is the nature of that being in relation to, as you said yourself in the paper, I don't like to use the word nature. You said yourself, there is no nature. I mean, the sense that we and nature, we tend to divide ourselves from it, whereas in fact, of course, we are, it's much part of that nature, as is any other entity in the biosphere. So they're one group of very, very interesting issues that you raised. The second very, very interesting question I thought fascinating was that you introduced the question of death. And I was reading about Lévi-Strauss just yesterday in the context of reviewing a book by the late Zygmunt Bauman, the distinguished sociologist, Polish-British sociologist, a new book of, not book of his, somebody's been collating his unpublished papers, many of them written in Polish, on actually culture and art. And in one of those papers, he talks about his own debt, but also his differences from Lévi-Strauss. Okay, that's not the point. The point is that Zygmunt Bauman was one of the few sociologists I know who ever addressed the question of mortality and death directly. Of course, he devoted one of his many books to that very subject of mortality and immortality, and an interesting argument there. But in your paper, of course, you've related this to regeneration and hazard. And I think this is partly where the meta-persons come back in. Excuse me, vulnerability is, I think, an integral part of human being, of course, and I think we all recognize this. Of course, we're also aware that most of the major religions are attempted to grapple with this in offering some kind of theory of, if not the nature of death, alternatively what is supposed to happen after death, or if you get recycled, if you take in these slightly incompatible theories, of course, whether you have a theory of reincarnation, that there is death as a sort of transition, but it's not a permanent state of extinction. Far from it, you're going to come back again in some form. Theories of rebirth, or theories that perhaps are closer to Christianity, notions of resurrection. Okay, the resurrection of the body, in fact, actually literally, okay, not as some, ghost or spirit, but then in some sense we resurrected in our physical form. So although we recognize that the time frame of human beings is one of finitude, I always think of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, if those who haven't heard of him, was the British playwright, late 19th century playwright, wit, and I suppose what today we would call a gay activist. And one of his favorite aphorisms, which I really love, was when he said, "I know everyone is mortal, but I did think an exception will be made in my case." I know everyone is mortal, but I did think an exception would be made in my case. And I suspect that secretly, a lot of us really go along with Oscar, in that respect. Well, yes, I mean, there's this death thing, but surely not me. There must be some exception here, and not the rest of you, perhaps, but surely I'm outside of this awful kind of thought, if it is awful. So essentially, I think you're really talking about a theory of time here, which I think you do mention quite explicitly in the paper. But an interesting one, because I remember as a first-year philosophy student struggling with this question of philosophy of time. What is it? Is it episodic? Is it a flow? Can it be measured? Is it infinitely divisible into any number of smaller and smaller units, and all that kind of stuff? But none of my philosophy teachers ever related the notion of time to the question of regeneration that you've raised, both of plants and of people. The generations succeeding each other in the way in which, in a sense, generations of plants succeed one another. And I propose here, it would be quite interesting to try a kind of science fiction idea, okay? To try to imagine for a few minutes a non-generative world, a world that does not, in fact, have death, a steady state world in which none of us die, because it's a sort of state, we're in a permanent state of being. And the problems that would arise from that kind of model, and indeed a number of writers, a number of science fiction writers have talked about this kind of idea, including kind of, terminal boredom. I mean, I'm actually eternal, you know, what am I going to do? Not till next year, you know, or the year after, or plan my vacation, you know. This is forever, right? Nothing in a sense changes. But I think implicitly or explicitly, you've drawn attention away from that kind of rigid model, that model of unchangingness, which is attractive, I think, in some religious thinking, to the fact that that is not how the world is structured. Cloning seeds, which is a key word in your thing. Now, again, I always thought as a child, somehow the word seed was magical. Now, I'm sure botanists, of course, obviously know what happens inside seeds. You know, if you stick it in the ground, it's not a mystery to them what will happen. It will germinate, hopefully, you know, after a few days or a week or whatever it is, it will pop up. But yet, I think many of us still live with that kind of metaphor as the seed, as indeed being something magic. That there is an element of re-enchantment, which was not a word you used, when you begin to talk about this notion of regeneration, that very process of growth, reproduction, death, and new life is in fact a form of enchantment. One thing that you didn't touch on at all, and it's not a criticism, you put so much in the paper, was the notion of sacrifice. And I thought it's interesting, since certainly in the past, of course, many anthropologists have talked about sacrifice itself often requiring the death, but then often the rebirth, of course, of a victim or of a deity, in fact, as in a sense in Christianity, of course, right? That sacrifice, in a sense, encapsulates an awful lot of these ideas around the idea of not impermanence exactly, but that impermanence, it reminds me of chaos theory. You know, what appears to be chaotic, in fact, points to a higher order. The death, in fact, appears to be discontinuity and the descent into chaos, but it itself points, if you like, to a higher order, not the kind of language you used at all, if that makes sense. I was very charmed by one phrase you used on some page 50 of your paper, in fact. Death is both an alternative mode of existence, one that comes to an end in further transformations. I really like that idea of death being an alternative form of existence, not a terminal point, but in fact, something which is, you know, I'm sure has its own charms. And indeed, in many religious traditions, of course, there are those charms. Whether it's, you know, the benefits of paradise or the pure land or whatever kind of future state that people have imagined over the centuries, that we would find ourselves translated into. Wonderful idea. Michelangelo, well, I suppose well-known Renaissance painter and sculptor, was also a poet of considerable quality. I don't know how much of his work is being translated, but I found in one of his poems a little sentence, which is, as you listening to your paper, reminded me of what you were talking about. One of his poems, Michelangelo says, "If life is agreeable, then so should death be, coming from the hands of the same master." The idea of a very different, of course, Michelangelo coming primarily, obviously, from a Catholic background. I don't think you had a lot of choice in Renaissance period Europe, except to dissemble your beliefs. So thank you for a very, very rich and wonderful paper. I'm in fact in Japan at this moment. I've been teaching at Kyoto University for the last 2 years. So let me just end up with a tiny anecdote from Japan. Not far from here, well, not close, but not very far from here, is a site which is considered probably the most sacred site of Shinto, the indigenous Japanese religion, even before Buddhism came. It's the Grand Shrine of Ise. And the Grand Shrine of Ise is of great antiquity, but with a paradoxical quality to it. Every 20 years, the shrine is taken down and one is reconstructed. An identical shrine is reconstructed on a site exactly parallel to the deconstructed shrine. So if you go to Ise, what you're seeing is a building which itself can never be more than 20 years old. But yet the site itself is considered one of antiquity. A very interesting paradox about the nature of time. Perhaps in the West, we tend to think this is a little fake. You know, something's old, that building, castle, cathedral, whatever it is, should have been there for centuries and centuries to qualify. But in Japan, that's not the case at all. The notion that everything is recycled, including ourselves, including the plant world, famously the cherry blossom and so on, seems to be a metaphor in a way for what you were talking about, and a very, very fascinating set of issues that you raised for us. Thank you very much indeed, Dame Marilyn. I hope those were not too far from the issues that you tried to raise, but I would hope we could shed not new light on them, but at least I think some of the implications of what you said are rich and fascinating. So thank you so much.
If I may respond very briefly, John, and to thank you for that wide-ranging and simultaneously detailed comprehension. If the convener and if the moderator will allow me, I'll just touch on 2 points, if I may, which I think might lead us into discussion. The first was the way you began marvelously with the notion that we're all responsible, but we're not quite sure what we're responsible for. And it was because of that I was doing something that anthropologists quite often discredit, which is that I wasn't justifying my argument in terms of mouths from the words of, I wasn't drawing directly on what people in Papua New Guinea had told me. I was making certain inferences because I too am not quite sure what I'm intending to explain. I just wanted to make that as a sort of point of method. You then raised several, from different ways, in talking about sacrifice, in talking about metapersons and so forth. You raised the question of mortality, and that instantly, of course, raises also the question of immortality. And it did strike me that in the way that the capacity for life becomes rechanneled, and deliberately involves a fresh embodiment of a previous body, that there's a sense in which the body is immortal. And this is very much contrasted, at least in the parts of Papua New Guinea that I know, with notions of the individuality of the person, who after an ancestral period is then sort of recoagulated with the generality of the past dead, and does not endure in an individual sense. So mortality and immortality are aligned very differently. But I'm sure there'll be other comments to follow from what you've opened up in such a magnificent way. Thanks so much.
To John, thank you, Marilyn. So to this depth and festival of conversation, it is my joy to invite Professor Sabyasachi now. Professor Sabyasachi teaches at Jamia Millia University. So Professor Sabyasachi, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Anand Giri, to give me this opportunity to reflect on a very rich and a very complex presentation given by Professor Marilyn. Equally complex is the comments from John Clammer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring some different perspective to the concepts that Marilyn has raised from the perspective of a different group of indigenous people that I have worked with over several years. These people come from central India. They are forest dwellers, and they live in a place called Shringar Bhum. Shringar Bhum literally means the decorated land. Their exposure to the outside world is very minimal. Once a year, they come out to get some salt. The rest of the year, they live inside the forest. And I spent many years doing my field work with them. I learned the language. I did work as part of their family, and I learned to understand how they think of the forest. And having understood their language of the forest, I tried to look at the modern world from that particular vocabulary. So what I'm going to say is something from that vocabulary to some of the concepts that you have brought forth for discussion. The concepts that you have that I'm going to talk about is valorization of life. Second one is about time and regeneration. And the third one is about death. There is much more to talk about, but given the shortage of time, I'll just stick to these three particular concepts. Well, from their perspective, the paradigm shift is very well acknowledged because the rate at which the forests regenerate is far, 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 far slower than the rate at which capital expects resources to get regenerated after they have been taken off. So the present crisis, in their perspective, would be that the rates at which we extract natural resources are far, 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 several times faster than the rates at which these natural resources can regenerate themselves. Now, this particular asymmetry results in a lot of problems. I want to look at valorization of life in the light of this asymmetry. Well, I do take your point that valorization of life is not healthy, as any valorization is not healthy. But given the kind of destruction that has happened because of these rates, life has become meaningless. People die a dozen, and there is a sense of angst, there is a sense of insensitivity that has grown into our sensibilities, that it does not make any difference anymore. We have been rendered absolutely numb in the face of death. Now, a certain amount of valorization of life in that phenomenal world is perhaps healthy in order to reactivate our sensibilities, which are now long dead and gone. This brings me to the second point of responsibility. How would anybody be responsible when all the senses are dead? When none of our senses are tactile to the living conditions, to the lives of people at large? It is very difficult to even think that there might be a sense of responsibility to deal with when your senses are absolutely, the senses have no, they don't receive the signals which are necessary for us to be human beings. I call this phenomenon the deforestation of the mind. The question of responsibility arises only when our senses have recovered the tactility. It's very important for us to therefore recognize that the manner in which capital works is by outsourcing our agency to many, many, many agencies. In other words, if I have to live by the logics of capital, I have to surrender my agency to so many different agencies that take over my life. Now, in that situation, where does the sense of responsibility even pose as a problem? Now, this is the modern world in which we live, and this is how, at some point, some amount of valorization of life is necessary for us to rekindle our humanness, to rekindle our tact. We have to make our senses live again. We have to begin to feel again in order to have the sense of responsibility. Now, there is a diagnosis of this problem from the standpoint of my friends who are forest dwellers. In their society, the important civilizational problem is put in one sentence. And it's really a puzzle. It's a philosophical paradox. According to them, the most difficult issue for any civilization is to decide what is worthy of remembering and what is worthy of forgetting. Total remembrance, total recovery of memory is impossible for life, as much as is total forgetting is impossible for life. And according to them, the modern civilization is not able to reconcile what has to be forgotten and what has to be remembered. The entire business of recording, the entire business of writing down histories, the entire business of writing down ethnographies is an act of memorizing and not forgetting. So one of my friends actually pointed out to me that the number of realistic accounts ethnographers have given of violence actually do not heal the wounds. They actually make the wounds even raw. So when somebody reads those accounts, he's not healed. He feels vengeance because the grotesqueness of the realism that some anthropologists perform is really grotesque. It does not heal the wounds inside. Now, a sense of responsibility first lies in an ethnographer's task of writing about truth, writing about what is real, writing about what is ugly, but at the same time writing in a fashion that heals the wounds. In their society, for them, what is missing in the modern discourse is the notion of fallow time. According to them, modern societies do not know of fallow time, because any time that is used for fallow is waste of time. It is waste of capital. Now, if we look at that concept very carefully, it is giving us two different notions of death, two different notions of regeneration, and two different notions of being. Notions of death. There is one form of death that we witness that is not regenerating. And that's where we need some valorization of life. But if we respect fallow time, then death is the fallow time. Death is conceptualized as fallow time. Now, fallow time is very important time because the meta beings that you referred to, the meta persons that you referred to, who are getting a huge amount of coverage in the media these days because of these revitalization, regenerative rituals. These people are out of step with the fallow time activities that happen in nature. So in their view, nature goes through seasonal hunger. Nature menstruates. Nature is resting during those periods of time, right? And for that reason, we have to understand that meta persons have a very important role to play as fallow time activities, not as production time activities. When meta persons become part of the modern production system, become part of the modern consumer society, then obviously there is a problem. Then their valorization of time as part of a capital recycle process is absolutely not welcome. But if meta persons are working within the regenerative processes of nature, which is fallow time, then I think they have an important role to play even today. My last point is about regeneration. I think I am quite fascinated by the works of Mircea Eliade, who talks of the myth of the eternal return as a very important anthropological source to understanding how people who are part of the modern capital world and want to reproduce capital through traditional indigenous regenerative practices, right, are going to see demons in the head. So India is full of these examples. We use regenerative rituals, for example, harvest festivals. Harvest rituals and ceremonies are performed in the cities these days. They're not performed in the field. They're not performed as part of an agricultural cycle. They're performed as part of a capital reproduction cycle. And it makes no sense for them to have regenerative rituals as part of a capital reproduction cycle, which is largely to promote tourism. Your paper is very, very fascinating because for the first time I have heard an anthropologist giving us accounts of plants and animals, plants and seeds, seeds and vegetative production, reproducing plants as part of a description of the climate change. An important point that I want to put here, the last point, is that some of my studies tell me that the best understanding of climate change, the most reliable understanding of climate change can be done only through studying the change of life cycles of plants. The plant life cycles have gone for a complete disorder. Some plants that were supposed to come before the rains are now coming 6 months later. Right? Some centipedes and millipedes that announced the oncoming of rain now coming in winter. Now, I think the fallow time has been disturbed. We have lost fallow time, and we are not sensitive to the fact that fallow time needs to be given privilege. Not only in understanding indigenous people who live very close to nature, but also to understanding the problems of modern society. So with these few comments, I would want to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to share these ideas with you, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabyasachi, with my heart, as usual, for bringing so many deep insights. So, Marilyn, at this stage, would you like to think with both John and Sabyasachi? And then we would invite other reflections, please.
I wanted to thank you so much for that constellation of ideas. I very humbly appreciate your comments. I thought, in fact, the point that you ended on was particularly interesting, because it is absolutely true that in that same Papua New Guinea that I visited in 2015, everybody was saying how the seasons were simply not flourishing as they should, and all the signs and markers that they were used to in telling them what to do and where to plant at particular times were haywire, basically. But that, of course, means that the sequences of other forms of life, of insects and birds and other beings dependent on the sequential flourishing of seasons is also very much out of joint. But I wanted to thank you very much, and it was a particular pleasure for me to hear a little bit about your own work with indigenous forest dwellers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marilyn. And Professor Sabyasachi's journey with fellow time also reminds us fellow time, FELLO. And that fellow time also includes metapersons, you know. And in Odisha, one of the important moment is called Raja. And as Professor Sabyasachi is referring to nature menstruating, and that is precisely a festival. And the significance of that has been written by Professor Frederick Marjolin Appel. So now let us deepen and widen our conversation. We are blessed by presence of many kind friends, and I request friends to kindly take up to 2 minutes or so to present their thoughts and questions. Let me invite Dr. N.K. Das, a very thoughtful anthropologist of our times, and who has also worked on many important issues. Dr. Das, please.
Please.
Thank you so much. But I was a little late. When I started, it was Marilyn had already started her speech, but I could get some of the points. So most of my work, is based in Northeast India, the Indo-Burmese border areas. And one of the communities in Assam, which I have studied, are called Karbis, the Karbis of Assam. Among the indigenous communities of Northeast India, probably Karbis are the only community among whom I found the death is celebrated. The death is celebrated, and they have a strong tradition of the mythological singing. This mythological singing is an important part of the Karbi ritual, death ritual. And this funeral ritual goes on for about 14 days or so. So this is very interesting situation where, you have a community where death is celebrated. Death is, mythologically in the recitation. They try to repeat. They try to narrate what a person's life has been, how Karbi community regenerates itself through death, and then the kind of ancestor worship that they have, and the entire ritual of ancestor worship. This ancestor worship is very peculiar to Karbis. In the Karbi situation, you have 14 days of ancestor, remembrance And you know, the what you call the collective memory of the Karbi people is one of the very fascinating things which I had liked among Karbis. And the time is not much to go into this, but one small fact I would like to tell you is that in one of the mythologies of the Karbi people, normally what happens, you know, the tribes have their, you know, the autonomous, you know, feeling. They have, you know, tribe, inter-tribe sort of this thing, you know, rupture, the kind of, you know, differentiation. But in case of Karbi, you know, this mythology, they speak of the birth from an egg. The egg gave birth not only to the Karbis, but also to the neighboring communities, Khasis, Nagas, and others. So what I find peculiar among the Karbis of Assam is that they have this peculiar, you know, ceremony of, you know, celebrating the death. At the same time, you know, they're narrating the, you know, birth of, you know, so many communities through egg. So this is a kind of, you know, situation where I find it is very fascinating among this community. Thank you so much.
So Dr. Das, and Dr. Das also has worked closely with Dr. K.S. Singh, a kind of doyen of a different anthropological journey for Nurture the People of India project, consisting of around 50 volumes. We are very enriched by the participation of many friends, including Professor Des Gasper, who has also reflected on development ethics and climate change. Professor Gasper, please. As Professor Gasper is taking a bit of time, let me invite Professor Meera Chakrabarti, please, who is a philosopher and scholar of literature teaching at Jain University, Bangalore.
Thank you, Ananta, and thank you, Marilyn. What I would try to draw attention is that death and regeneration are part of the one and the same being, and that's why the concept of or the issue of being becomes extremely relevant, very important, because these are not seen as something isolated. They are together. And since India, you mentioned the Indian context, I would like to give a little more information about that. That what we have taken for granted is that the wildlife or the forest or the valorization life is one-sided. No, they are, you know, they sometimes we are sometimes simultaneously repulsed by, attracted to, and reliant upon the forest or the wildlife equally as we are nurtured. So these are the very ambivalent relationship that we have with environment, that we have to, and we try to control, which, and we fail very badly. We realize that our powers are quite limited. My question will be that what are these legacies of these struggles, since we know that, and I have Ananta's another conference where it was on Gandhi. I brought the dimension of being, where, because by the very being, everything gets inclusive. Being, the concept of being in Indian school of thought is all inclusive, and therefore there is no environment which is other and me as something else. So this is very kind of an inherent understanding which these schools of the thinkers had. So therefore, regeneration and death have been reflected on very seriously in Indian thought, and they have been accepted as two sides of the same coin. However, death has not been perceived as something negative, and therefore your question of being, which can really lead to radical revision, I hope, of the earlier perceptions and judgments of the valorization of life, I look forward to that. This is going to bring a very radical revision. So my question was that how when the global powers are shaping and reshaping themselves, how would you tell them to really what will be the future of activism, future of thinking, future of the kind of inherently different language that we should use it. So because it doesn't, this reshaping of global power doesn't look very positive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mira. So now, friends who would like to ask a question, please use in the chat box, indicate. In the meantime, I request the friends, beginning with Minati, please. And I'm telling these friends to kindly get ready. Minati, after that, Professor Vinita Singh, then Gyan Luigi, Sudha, please.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
yeah.
please. You are
Good
audible.
Evening, everyone. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Actually, I am very much enriched by Professor Marilyn's presentation, Professor Clammer, Professor Sabyasachi, and all these discussions. So while listening to all these things, only one line was playing in my mind once I read in Deepak Chopra's one essay. It was like, no, the space will remain, but the place may not with the time. So all these things I can summarize into these things. So I wanted to ask a question, but as I'm outside now, so I just cannot concentrate more. So thank you, and thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Minati. Minati is a poet and a very active co-nurturer of our circle of dialogue. And now, Gianluigi, please. Gianluigi, John referred to Italy. Gianluigi is from Italy, and now he's based in Vienna. He's a philosopher. So, Gianluigi.
Thank you very much. I hope I am audible. It was very interesting. I would like to thank very much for the speakers. Well, my question would be perhaps connected in a metaphorical form to the concept of regeneration. That is, I think that the principal obstacle to regeneration is when we, for instance, take into consideration the work of the philosopher Caroline Merchant and her book, The Death of Nature, that from a certain point, mainly in the Western culture, the concept of the scientific revolution has degraded step after step the nature to an object which is there in order to produce wealth, for instance, and has developed a mentality of a dualism between the subject, that is we, the man, the human beings, on the one side, and on the other side, the nature. Whereas we are the subject and nature is only an object. It is this way of reasoning about nature, which is considered as being only an object, only something which is material, which is to be measured. And it is perhaps the main obstacle to every attempt at regeneration or also generation of nature, because nature is not considered as an autonomous subject. And we are not in the nature, we are something else. That is, there is a rigid demarcation, border, separation, rigid separation between us and nature. And well, another point that it came to my mind while hearing was, for instance, that in the animal ethics, many times it is underlined that in the usual consideration of animals, it is spoken of animal farms. That is, as if animals would be something like crop, something which is only without soul, without subjectivity. That is, it is a further process of degradation of everything which is living to something which is in truth not living, not subject but object. So I would say that the book of Carolyn Merchant, The Death of Nature, can give a contribution to understand why there are obstacles to every mentality of regeneration of nature as an autonomous subject and not as a depending object. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Mucho gracias, Gianluigi. So now Professor Vinita Singh, please.
I don't have any questions to ask, just an observation to make. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers that after a very long period, I really feel healed from within, because this is one place where I find philosophy and anthropology, the much neglected subjects in today's commercial world. I teach in a simple college, and these are dying subjects. We virtually have to pull in students to anthropology and to philosophy. They go for other subjects which are job oriented. So they don't realize the wealth of this subject, and it's a pity. I feel bad that these two subjects, core disciplines, and the manner in which they need to be nurtured and nourished. I fight for the survival of these two subjects, because until and unless your roots are not properly nurtured and nourished, you just cannot think capital, capital, capital. What's the end? What's the end? Where does capitalism lead to? You're just a hollow, shallow thing. And I'm glad that Anant has found such a wonderful company in Marilyn. And I'm meeting Anant thanks to Randhir. Around a decade, I haven't met him and interacted with him. Thanks to Randhir for having given me the opportunity. I'm a huge fan of Anant's Oriya poems. I didn't know him as an anthropologist, but the philosophy within his Oriya poems, which he writes, was really, healing from within. How philosophy and anthropology can be blended, that we are seeing it today on this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinita. Thank you so much. Now, Sandhya Appa, please. Sandhya Rani Giri. And you can speak in Odia. I will translate. Okay, she's taking some time. Now, Sudha, please. Sudha. Okay, Sudha is taking some time. Now, Randhir, please. Randhir.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. And I'm really very enriched by the presentation and by honorable speaker, and very enriched by our discussions also, as John Clammer and Professor Sachi have already indicated. But I am very much concerned about Professor Vinita Madam already highlighted the neglect of anthropology and neglect of philosophy for that matter, because sustainable leadership emerged in a very highly unsustainable society led by the present type of unsustainable science for that matter. And Professor Anitra, she is from Yale University. She was last speaker, and I used the word concept, I would say, deforestation of mind, which I learned from Professor Sachi. And I think deforestation of mind is a kind of ideal type, which is the root cause of, all this development of industrial civilization, which exploits nature in its all terms. Putting some psychological, psychoanalytical insight, once Sigmund Freud said that the ultimate aim of life is death. So degeneration is, if degeneration is the cause of caused by deforestation of mind, then we have to also be optimist, as Marilyn in her paper, he start argument with the idea of hope. And we have to understand that degeneration is also a process which is inevitable for the development of regeneration. So in that sense, putting some Hegelian or dialectic of life, this really incomplete. One later or sooner, we have already, know the limitation of this science, which can only predict, but cannot control, cannot prevent us from climate crisis. We have to again go back to the indigenous knowledge, as Professor Sachi and Marilyn, already highlighted from the concern of or learning insight of the worldview of indigenous people. Or we can also here incorporate Gandhian insights. So thank you so much for a very, very insightful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Randhir. And we have Devendra with us, Dr. Devendra Tiwari, who would be our last gifter of insights.
For giving me the opportunity, and first of all, I would like to convey my thanks to Professor Marilyn and the discussants of the session. Really, it was full of information, and as I would like to support Professor Vinita's statement, healing from inside. Although I don't have any question, but some observations I would like to present here. Marilyn started deliberation.
I think we lost his connection, sir. Professor Giri, you are muted.
So, Dr. Tiwari, your connection is not coming. So, we are on another occasion. So now, Marilyn, please, your thoughts on some of these issues with us, please.
Network. Should I continue?
Hello, Dr. Tiwari, there is problem of connection. We'll come back to it a little later. So let us hear Marilyn's thoughts, please.
Sure.
Well, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the several remarks that people have made with references to other studies of indigenous peoples, but also references to other philosophies and ways of being, so to speak. And I just wanted to have a very brief comment on those comments that were raised in terms of how does one transition from such an insight into articulating anything that might have presence in the world. And of course, a reference was made to the teaching of anthropology and philosophy in this context. I think I look on academic labor as very much involved with the division of labor. We all work away at a particular area and issue. We're none of us alone. It is wonderful when on occasions like this, ideas can travel. But I think I've learned that, how can I put it? Speaking to power, requires particularly powerful set of skills. That is, one cannot translate instantly into something that will then communicate itself to global powers or whatever. Rather, the question is precisely the cultivation of minds, and I'm assuming on this occasion, as in many occasions where I've listened to speakers, if everyone makes the, how can I put, you turn what is said into something of your own, I think as oneself being some kind of being an activist and spreading out along activist networks, the cultivation of one's own mind isn't incidental to the kind of effect one might have on other people. The other issues that were brought up seems to me to revolve around the divide that is so often made between the activities of human beings and nature itself, and we were presented with a very strong case in terms of the subject-object division. And I think our capacity to create languages in which to talk, as it were, outside of that particular division is incredibly important. But I'm very grateful to everybody who's contributed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Thank you. Now, Devendra, if your line is still working.
Sir, yes, it's working, sir.
And
so I was saying, sure. So Professor Marilyn, ma'am started her deliberation by quoting life in death. And I would like to correlate ma'am's statement by a poem by S.T. Coleridge, Ancient Mariner, Rhyme of Ancient Mariner. In that there is a myth when that mariner is encountered by two ghosts. They say, because of the crime you have committed, you have two options to choose. One is death in life or life in death. So they provide him life in death, means perhaps there is some disturbance in network at my end. So it is. Hello.
Hello.
Sir, because of, I think, fluctuation in network, I'm getting this connection time and again. Okay. So, although I had some important observations, but because of this network disruption, I'm unable to present at this platform.
So thank you. Then we will quickly move on to vote of thanks. Maybe Randhir, you would present the vote of thanks.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir, for asking me to present vote of thanks. First, I would like to thank you for a very excellent presentation by Professor Marilyn Strathern. Thank you so much, madam, for your generosity and very excellent presentation. And I would like to thank Professor John Clammer. As usual, he put some more sociological insight in order to bring more wisdom and knowledge. Thank you so much, sir, for giving excellent discussion role. How can I forget Professor Sabyasachi? As usual, he put some very deep anthropological, philosophical insight. And being a student of him, I learned a lot from him. He's also source of my inspiration. Thank you so much, sir, for coming and bestowing your good blessings. Professor Gyan Gului, Professor Navya Kishore, sir, thank you so much for your excellent comment. And Maniti Pradhan, I know you are outside, otherwise you must have presented one poem. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for your generosity and for your
Next
kind
time I will show. Next time I will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Marilyn, and all friends. And
if it is okay, should I
no, the line
because of disruption in network?
The line is not coming, so we'll wait for another occasion. So
Thank you.
Okay, so
there is one line is that our reference to poetic also brings the invitation of philosophy, anthropology, and literature. And when we read,
they want me to
just Minati, 1 minute. So therefore, while reading Marilyn, we also find a deep poetic being at work. For example, in the line that the pigs must be missing. so then our submission is that in Marilyn's work and in all our work, how do we cultivate like a gardener, the philosophical, anthropological, and the poetic, which would be a kind of our new journey with the calling of the time. So with this, thank you, Marilyn, and we are grateful to you, and we hope that at your convenience, we would have the gift and blessing of your presence on another occasion. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Vinita, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you.